For a long time, I told myself that silence was something I chose. That it was intentional. Measured. A sign of maturity. People admire restraint. They mistake it for wisdom. And for years, I let that belief protect me. Because as long as silence was a choice, I didn't have to examine what it was costing me. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It gathers. It takes form slowly, the way fog does, unnoticed until it suddenly defines the landscape. I started noticing it in small ways. How often I paused before answering simple questions. How carefully I edited my reactions. How instinctively I avoided saying anything that might require clarification later. I wasn't hiding. I was managing. And management, I would learn, is not the same as freedom. I didn't sit down to write a letter. That would have required admitting there was something I needed to send. I thought of it as notes. Fragments. Sentences with no destination. That framing mattered. Because a letter implies accountability. And I wasn't ready for that yet. There are feelings that don't hurt enough to demand attention. They settle instead. They stay quiet. Patient. You learn to carry them the way you carry weight you don't remember picking up. Until one day, you notice your posture has changed. That was when I realized something inside me had been waiting far too long to be acknowledged. Not dramatically. Just honestly. A voice invites interruption. It creates witnesses. Consequences. Paper doesn't. Paper listens without asking you to justify yourself. It lets you pause mid-thought without insisting you finish. I told myself I wasn't confessing anything. Just organizing. But organization is often the first step toward clarity. And clarity is dangerous. I tried to begin gently. Something vague enough to retreat from later. But every attempt collapsed under its own dishonesty. Eventually, one sentence remained. Uncomfortable. Precise. I've been quiet longer than I meant to. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because that sentence didn't describe a moment. It described a pattern. And patterns don't dissolve quietly. The paragraphs that followed were careful. Balanced. I sounded like someone who had already made peace with everything. Which should have been my warning. People who are truly at peace don't rehearse it. They don't explain their calm. They don't polish their restraint until it shines. That version of the letter was composed. Too composed. There were sentences that arrived fully formed, and were immediately rejected. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they were irreversible. Sentences like, I organized my life around what you never said. I learned how to miss you quietly. Those sentences did not ask permission. So I left them out. And called the letter honest anyway. Placing the pages into an envelope felt symbolic. Final. I told myself that meant courage. That one day, I would send it. Not now. But when timing felt kinder. Eventually became my favorite word. It offered hope without urgency. And urgency is where courage is tested. Waiting looked responsible from the outside. It sounded like patience. Like emotional intelligence. Time passed quietly. The urgency softened, not because the feeling disappeared, but because I learned how to coexist with it. And there is something seductive about discomfort you know how to manage. It doesn't ask you to change. I found the letter again much later than I expected. That detail matters. Because it never announced itself. It appeared only when I wasn't prepared. Reading it then felt different. Distant. Incomplete. So I rewrote it. Not louder. Just closer to the center of what I had been avoiding. I added one sentence. There are things I never stopped feeling, even when I stopped admitting them. That sentence shifted everything. Because once written, it removed my ability to pretend this was harmless. There is a moment when honesty stops feeling freeing. It starts feeling expensive. Because it demands consequences. Once something is acknowledged, even privately, your life begins responding to it. The letter no longer felt optional. It demanded a decision. And I wasn't ready to make one. Unsent things have a strange power. They don't force grief. They don't require closure. As long as the letter remained unsent, the story remained open. And open stories feel safer than finished ones. That's the part no one tells you. Sometimes, waiting feels like control. Over time, the letter stopped being an exception. It became rehearsal. I noticed how often I edited myself before speaking. How instinctively I softened truths. How naturally I chose silence when clarity might have caused discomfort. The letter had taught me how to live partially expressed. There was one night. Only one. Everything was ready. Envelope. Address. Stamp. Nothing dramatic had happened that day. And that terrified me. Because without drama, I had no excuse. Just a decision. I imagined his reaction. Not idealized. Human. And realized what frightened me wasn't rejection. It was finality. This is where honesty sharpens. I wasn't afraid of his response. I was afraid of what his response would require of me. Because once the letter was sent, waiting would end. And waiting had become familiar. Change had not. Time is patient. It doesn't rush your decisions. But it doesn't leave them unanswered either. While I waited, life rearranged itself. Doors closed without announcing themselves. Moments passed that would not return. And slowly, I understood that not choosing had been a choice all along. The truth arrived without ceremony. The letter was never meant to be sent. It wasn't written for him. It was written for me. As evidence. Proof that something real had existed. That silence hadn't erased it, only delayed its cost. The letter still exists. Not folded. Not hidden. But no longer waiting. Because now it asks something else. Not whether I will send it. But whether I will continue living as someone who withholds herself to stay safe. Some letters change nothing because they are never sent. But they change everything in the way we learn to live around what we never said. And that is where this part pauses. Not ends. Pauses. Waiting stopped being something I did. It became something I spoke. I learned how to answer questions without answering them. How to smile in a way that suggested contentment without promising it. How to let conversations drift away from anything that might require clarity. People didn't question it. Waiting, when done quietly, rarely alarms anyone. Time moved the way it always does when you are not looking directly at it. Ordinary days piled up. They didn't feel important while they were happening. That's the danger of ordinary days. They feel neutral until you realize how much they have rearranged. Nothing dramatic marked their passing. But everything I didn't choose was being chosen anyway. The letter stayed exactly where it was. But it changed. Its weight shifted from urgency to familiarity. And familiarity is deceptive. It convinces you that unresolved things are somehow resolved simply because they no longer disrupt your routine. The letter became part of the background of my life. Quiet. Persistent. I adapted. That's what I told myself. I learned how to want things without reaching for them. How to care without disturbing the balance of my life. How to survive without demanding more from myself. Adaptation looks impressive. It earns compliments. From the inside, it feels like narrowing. I noticed it in conversation. How quickly I redirected topics. How instinctively I softened statements before they could land. How naturally I avoided anything that might require explanation later. I wasn't just editing words. I was editing outcomes. And slowly, my life became smaller without feeling unsafe. The letter never promised a response. That was something I projected onto it. In truth, it promised only honesty. And honesty doesn't guarantee relief. Sometimes it simply removes your ability to keep pretending. There is a particular warmth in almost. Almost sending. Almost speaking. Almost choosing differently. Almost lets you feel possibility without paying the cost of change. Once you understand that, almost becomes seductive. And seduction rarely announces itself as danger. There was a day that passed without a single notable moment. No message. No interruption. No shift in the air. And that was when it became clear. Nothing was coming to rescue me from my own waiting. Time does not negotiate. It responds to indecision by moving forward. While I waited, other versions of my life filled the space. Responsibilities. Routines. Paths that closed quietly. And eventually, the question changed. It was no longer should I send the letter? It became does the moment that required it still exist? There was no final sign. No moment that officially ended the possibility. Just a slow understanding that the window had already closed. Not because of him. Because of me. Because waiting had quietly become a choice I kept making. I didn't grieve the response I never received. I grieved the version of myself who might have spoken sooner. The one who didn't confuse safety with wisdom. The one who trusted herself enough to risk being known. That grief didn't ask for tears. It asked for clarity. When I returned to the letter, I no longer saw it as a possibility. It was evidence. Evidence of how carefully I had learned to contain myself. Of how much of my life had been shaped by what I chose not to say. The letter had never been about him. It had always been about me. The letter never left because it was never meant to. It wasn't written to change the past. It was written to expose the cost of silence. And once I saw that, sending it no longer made sense. The question shifted. It was no longer, should I send it? It became, who do I become when I consistently withhold myself? That question followed me. Into rooms. Into decisions. Into the way I measured my own life. If something in this story feels too close, It's because most people carry something unfinished. Not always a letter. Sometimes a boundary. A truth. A sentence that never found its voice. Unfinished things shape us whether we acknowledge them or not. Courage is often misunderstood. It is not loud. It does not arrive with certainty. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to speak even when silence has become comfortable. Even when waiting feels safer. Even when the outcome remains unknown. I read the letter one final time. Not to decide its fate, but to understand mine. I didn't fold it. I didn't hide it. I let it exist exactly as it was. Unsent. But no longer unanswered. Nothing about the letter changed. But everything around it did. I stopped rehearsing explanations. Stopped editing myself for ease. Stopped mistaking restraint for wisdom. The letter had done what it was meant to do. Some stories do not need conclusions. They need recognition. They need you to see them clearly enough to stop repeating them. That was the real ending. Some letters are never sent because they are not messages. They are mirrors. They exist to show us how long we have been living as someone smaller than we needed to be. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is not send the letter, but finally stop writing your life. As if you are still waiting for permission. If this story felt familiar. If there's something in your life you've never said out loud. Something you learned to carry quietly. You're not alone. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment. Not to explain. Not to justify. Just to say, I understand.